The second important piece of master data is the vendor. Now, we know that there are so many different materials that we plan, produce, or manufacture. But when we procure any of these materials, who supplies them? Well, my coffee store could have many different vendors. Why do I need so many vendors? Well, the answer is simple. Not everybody can supply everything, right? So, for example, there is a generic supply company called, say, ABC Supplies. He can supply most of the materials, but he doesn't specialize in any. And for baking related goods like the oven or baking sheets, I could procure them from Central Baking Supplies. And for anything related to coffee, specifically for coffee, we have another vendor. And any other brewing supplies could be had from this vendor. And each of them are different. So you got to create so many different vendors. So how is a vendor master structured? So just like the material master has so many different views, a vendor master also has 3 views. The general view, which contains name, number, etc. Finance view and purchasing view. General view, finance view, and purchasing view. So let's go create a vendor. So go to logistics, material management, purchasing, master data, vendor, and then we have purchasing and central. Then either go to purchasing and create only the general and purchasing view of the vendors like so, or we can go to central and create all the 3 different views. Let's go to central. Go click XK01 and specify a vendor, say 4002. I think we have already created 4001, right? And then use US01, purchase org US01, account group 0001. We don't want to really refer any vendor, just click enter. So it looks like 4002 already exists, so we're going to use 4003. Give it a name, say coffee supplies, right? Give a name, coffee supplies, and then say CS for coffee supplies, and it could have an address, we don't care, and he's in Chicago, in the state of US Illinois, right? You could also have a telephone number here, so 312-000-0000, and then you could have a fax number, email, and all different kinds of communication here, and then hit enter. Now there are so many different fields, right? We're not going to bother ourselves with all the different fields. There are some important fields, yes. For example, customer is an important field, but not for us at this point. So I'm going to only focus on the fields that we need for now. The rest of the fields we're just going to gloss over. Hit enter again. This is bank data. Yes, bank data is important. But when is bank data important? When you want to pay the vendor. Paying the vendor is a finance transaction. So we don't care. Hit enter. Recon account. So although recon account is something that finance needs to worry about, but without a recon account, we can't do certain transactions. So make sure that you enter a recon account. And then cash management group, select something. Whatever is there, just put it in. Hit enter. Payment terms. Now this is an important parameter. Let me explain what payment terms are. So what is payment terms? So if you take a transaction, say we have produced 100 pounds of coffee. So we have produced 100 pounds of coffee at $10 per pound. So that's $1,000. So the value of the invoice that the vendor has sent is $1,000. Now when do we need to pay the vendor the $1,000? Do we need to pay it as soon as we receive the invoice? If not, how much time do we have? That's exactly what payment terms dictates. And each vendor could offer a different set of payment terms. Let's examine a simple payment term. Say net 30. What does it mean? It means that if you receive the invoice on Jan 1st, you have until 30 days to pay the invoice. So the vendor is giving you a credit for 30 days. And then there's net 45, net 60, you get the picture. On top of that, there is something called as cash discount. So to encourage customers to pay earlier, vendors tend to give a cash discount. Example, net 30, 2% 20 days. Net 30, 2% 20 days. This is another example of payment term. What this means is, if you pay within 20 days, you get a cash discount of 2%. So out of 1,000, you only need to pay $980 because the $20, which is 2% of 1,000, is given as a cash discount. So this is payment terms. Let's see some examples of payment terms in SAP. Now remember, payment terms are mostly created by FI folks. So we don't really care about how to create them as long as we understand what payment terms are. So let's go and see what payment terms we have. Okay, 001 payment due net. In some cases that payment term is used, but for the most part we use something like this. 002. 002 is a key for payment term for net 45. And then there are some cash discounts. That means that you got to pay the invoice in 45 days, and if you pay the invoice in 30 days, you get a 2% cash discount, and if you pay it within 14 days, you get a 3% cash discount. Right? So these are all different examples of payment terms. There are some other scenarios like baseline dates, so on and so forth, but we don't need to get into that. For now, select payment terms of 0002, then hit enter. Keep going, we don't worry about dunning. And then the order currency is USD, say, and terms of payment is 0002. Now, why do we have two terms of payments here? Let's see. This is where the different views come in. So the vendor, Chicago Coffee Supplies, had three views, right? Like any other vendor. General, purchasing, finance or company code. In company code view, you could have the payment term of 0002, and in purchase org view, you could have a payment term of 0003. Why is that? The reason is simple. Remember how we structured our enterprise? So in the entire US, you could have one company code, and underneath that there could be multiple plants, and each plant could have its own purchase org, right? That means, so if you take our coffee shop, we have registered it in Chicago as US01, and our main plant is in Chicago, and then you could have more in Seattle, in New York, so on and so forth. And purchase orgs could be assigned to each of these plants, or they could be assigned for more than one plant. Either way, the point being, if you are maintaining vendor data relating to this particular purchase org, you could have a different payment terms. What it essentially does for you is let you have different payment terms for the same vendor for different purchase orgs. That means that you can choose to have a vendor pay in net 45 in Chicago and net 60 in Seattle. That's the flexibility that SAP is providing us by giving us different payment terms at different levels. One at the company code level or finance level, and another at the purchase org level. So that means that the same vendor can have so many different purchasing views, as many as you want. One for each purchasing org. Or if you don't want them, you don't need to maintain them. For example, this vendor, say ABC Supplies, say Chicago Brewing Company, only works in Chicago. In that case, there's no point in creating it for another purchasing org, say in Canada, if you have a shop in Canada or Mexico. And the next parameter is Incoterms. What's an Incoterm? An Incoterm stands for International Commerce. INCO stands for International Commerce. So when you trade goods across cities, across countries, there needs to be a standardized way of specifying how the goods are transferred. So say for example, you want to ask the vendor for a certain set of terms. Say you want to ask the vendor to deliver the goods free to your warehouse. It's called FOB, which says free on board. And then until what point? Until warehouse. Sometimes it could be just until the dock. Sometimes it could be until his own plant. So Incoterm has two parts. Part 1 is a standard term and part 2 is a free-form text. You could qualify part 1 in part 2. For example, free on board. Free on board until where? Warehouse. Another example is CIP, carriage and insurance paid. By whom? Until what point? Can be specified in part 2. Let's go see some examples. Go to Incoterms and specify free on board until the warehouse. So Incoterms is basically an industry standard term that's used to specify the logistics of the purchase. And then we have a whole bunch of indicators here, like the different kinds of control data. Again, not all of them are important, so we're not going to worry about all of them. But when we see certain business scenarios that require us to understand some of the terms, we'll revisit them. For now, just hit OK. Same thing with partner functions. We're going to revisit them when we see partner determination. Hit OK and save. You have created the vendor 4003. Alright, time for an exercise. What are the org elements required to create a vendor in XK01? So what is XK01? XK01 is a central way to create three different views: general, company code, and purchasing. So what do you need? You need three things. General doesn't need an org element. It's just address and phone number and fax number. Company code requires the company code. Purchasing view requires purchasing org. So you need two org elements. Purchasing org for the purchasing view, company code for the finance view. What are the org elements required to create a vendor in XK01? Number 2, what are the transaction codes just to create a general and purchasing view of the vendor? So we have seen XK01, which is the central way of creating all three different views. But what about the transaction codes create just the purchasing view? Number 3, what is the transaction code to create the general and finance view of the vendor? Number 4, what is the cash discount if paid within 30 days for SAP Standard Payment Terms 013? Again, the purpose of this exercise is so that you can log into SAP and practice these things, and when you start doing what's being asked here, you'll know for sure that you have done these transactions yourself. So don't worry if these questions sound too silly. The purpose is to ensure that you do it in the system. Give some examples of payment terms available in SAP without cash discount. What does part 2 of the Incoterm refer to? Number 7. What does Incoterm's COD stand for? In the previous videos, we have seen vendor master and material master. And we said that not all vendors supply all the materials. So some vendors supply some materials and some other vendors supply other materials. So where is the relationship between the vendor and material documented? So if I want to know who can supply whole wheat flour, I need to be able to understand that it's this vendor and maybe this vendor. Right? I need that information handy. And how much is it going to cost for this vendor versus this vendor? So the relationship between materials and vendors is created in what's called as a purchasing info record, or info record for short. So what kind of data is available in an info record? Let's go create one. So go back. So where is the info record? So we go to logistics, material management, purchasing, and then go to master data, go to info record, and there you have. M11, 12, 13. So go to create mode, M11, put your vendor 4003 or 4001, and don't worry about entering the plant for now. I'll tell you why you need to enter a plant a little bit later. So select coffee beans, hit enter, and info record has also a bunch of screens. It has purchasing related data, general data, text, so on and so forth. Again, not all fields are important at this point, and for now here are some of the important fields. Planned delivery time. This tells you how long it takes for this vendor to supply this material. This tells you how long it takes for the vendor to supply this material. Say this vendor takes 10 days to supply coffee beans. And then what's the typical standard quantity? Do we order 100 pounds? Do we order 10 pounds? Do we order 50 pounds? And then there could be a minimum order quantity. So some vendors don't take orders below a certain number, just for convenience reasons. So the minimum order quantity is, say, 20 pounds. So the standard order quantity is 100 and minimum order quantity is 20. And then we have delivery tolerances, important fields, but we're not going to touch about them now. And the net price. What's the net price? $10 per pound. And a purchasing group of US1. Hit enter. Hit enter. Hit enter again. And here you can put in some text. Now I'm not going to bother about this text now, but we're going to revisit this when we cover text determination in a later chapter. Enter and save. So for 4003 vendor for coffee beans, we have created a record. Let's go create a purchase order now. ME21N for vendor 4003. Put the material coffee beans and enter 10 pounds in plant Chicago 1. First thing that you see, order quantity is below 20 pounds. Remember, we have entered the minimum order quantity as 20. So it's giving us a warning. So it's a warning, so you can hit enter and let it go away. Alright, the next thing. Today's date is 22 April 2016. And what's the delivery date? May 2nd, 2016. So the system has added 10 days to April 22, and that comes to May 2nd, and set that as a delivery date, the date on which we can receive the goods. Why? Because we have set the number of days for delivery as 10 days for this vendor and material combination. So as SAP takes the number of days from the info record, adds it to the current date, and puts them in the delivery date field. And $10. Who specified that for this vendor and coffee beans the price is $10? We did it when we created the purchase info record. So what's an info record? Info record ties the material to the vendor. Why do you create info record? We create info record so that at any given point in time we know what a vendor can supply, or we also know who can supply a particular material. What are the details that go into it? So for a particular purchasing org, you can even narrow down it by plant if you want, but you don't need to. You specify how long it takes for the vendor to deliver that particular material. So you call them and ask them how long it takes. He says 5 days. You put 5 there. You put the purchase org and you also put the standard quantity. Standard quantity does not really have a lot of functionality, but minimum quantity can be used to give a warning if at all vendor requires us to procure in a certain minimum lot. And then you put a price, $2, $5, $10, whatever that material costs from that vendor. And if you look at the price, you see a 2 followed by a comma followed by 5, right? So the intention there is 2.50, but it shows it as a comma. If you want to try it, go to M11. This time let's do it for vendor 4001. Hit enter, and so if you say 2, so if you put in $2, the system automatically takes it as 2.00. But sometimes you could see it as 2.00, like how it shows here. The reason is not all countries, unfortunately, specify decimals as with a dot. Some countries do it with a comma. So in order to account for that, SAP has specified something called as a user profile. So go back. No. Go to SU3. That's a transaction to check your own user profile. So it's dependent on the user. So the user is in Germany and his profile is set to German profile. He can have a comma in place of decimals. Hit enter. And this is my profile. And if I go to defaults, this specifies what my decimal notation is. So it's the same number behind the scenes, but when it shows that to me, if my decimal notation is comma with dots, it shows it like this. But if it's commas in place of dots, it shows it like this. So you can choose it either way you want. Try it with different possible combinations, so you'll understand what I mean by decimal notation. So that's user profile. Transaction code for this is SU3. So we have seen that the delivery date comes from here, and we have seen that the price comes from here, and we have seen that the price comes from here. So let's look at the purchase order once again. A purchase order has header and then line items. Most of the data in the header comes from the vendor, and most of the data in the line items come from material. Now this is very important. So anytime you look at a piece of data, say you saw this unit of measure and want to understand where this came from, follow the thumb rule. Anything from the header comes from the vendor. Anything in the line item, this is a line item field, it comes from the material master. The reason why I mention this is because you can't really understand the source of all the different fields in the purchase order. There are hundreds of fields in the purchase order, and you can't possibly know what each field is and what's the source of it. Just remember the thumb rule. Header from the vendor, line items from the material. So anytime in the future if you have a question on a particular field, just check yourself. Is it in the header or line item? If it is in the header, this field should come from the vendor master. So go check the vendor. If it's a line item, go to the material master. Let's talk a little bit about texts. And before we go to texts, since we have just finished materials, vendors, and info records, I want to use the sheet. So these are the list of materials. Think of this as an extension to the previous exercises. So I want you to create all these materials, create all these vendors, then set the info records like this vendor is going to take 10 days to supply the goods, and he's going to supply it at $5 per pound or per kilo. Then you can put a comment there. Now think of comments like this: stirrers for Chicago Brewing Supply Company. You want to put a comment saying it should be of brown color and should have a crown. Or if you take coffee bags, if you want to get them from this vendor, you want to put a comment over there saying that it should be a 1 pound aluminum bag only, say, as opposed to jute bags or paper bags. That's how you want to brand your stuff as. Where do you specify these comments? There are a number of places that you can specify these comments. A simple way to specify comments is the material master. Comment is basically a text. So if you go to the material master, go to MM02, which is changing the material, go to coffee beans, hit enter, and select purchase order text. And of course enter your plant, CHA1. You could put a text here. And these coffee beans, you want them supplied in aluminum bags only. You have just tagged this material with a little text note and click save. Go here and create another order. ME21N and vendor 4001. So when you create a purchase order for this vendor and coffee beans for $10, since you specified that little note in the coffee beans, you should see that as a text here in the text tab. You see material PO text, and it says aluminum bags. I didn't enter it manually here because we have entered that in the material master purchasing text view. It automatically defaults to this tab, and it defaults to a particular kind of text called the material PO text. And what good is this if it doesn't reach the vendor with that particular thing printed on the paper or PDF? So let's go do a print preview. So do you see that here? Aluminum bags. So what did we just do? We went to the material master, put a little instruction, which is basically tagging the material with a particular text. And we have seen that when we create a purchase order for that material, that text automatically flows in. And when you print it, it gets printed on the PO that reaches the vendor. So the vendor knows that he has to supply it in aluminum bags. So this is a little additional piece of information that you want to supply to the vendor when he reads the PO.